You open your textbook. You see the chapters neatly divided. Native Americans here, African Americans there. Two separate stories, two separate struggles. But what if that division was a lie? What if entire nations of people who are both Black and Native have been systematically erased from the story America tells about itself? This isn't about a few isolated families. This is about communities, entire towns, nations of people whose existence challenges the very foundation of racial categories in this country. Their story is one of survival, resistance, and a deliberate campaign of erasure that continues to this day. By the time we're done, you'll understand how systems like the Dawes Rolls were designed to cut dark-skinned families out of their own heritage, and why textbooks still refuse to acknowledge that Black and Native histories were never separate. They were always intertwined. To understand this hidden history, we need to get the language right, because the terms themselves tell a story of how America tried to categorize people into boxes that never really fit. First, you have intermarriage. This wasn't rare or accidental. From the earliest colonial times, Africans escaping slavery and Native peoples resisting displacement found common cause. They formed families, built communities, and created new identities that blended both cultures. These unions produced generations of people who were, quite simply, both. Then, there were the Maroons, perhaps the most revolutionary figures in early American history. These were communities of escaped slaves who established independent settlements, often in alliance with Native nations. The most famous were the Black Seminoles in Florida, but Maroon communities existed from the Great Dismal Swamp to the Mexican border. They weren't just hiding. They were building free societies outside the control of colonial powers. But the term that becomes most crucial to understanding the legal erasure is freedmen. After the Civil War, treaties forced the so-called Five Civilized Tribes to free their slaves and grant them citizenship. These newly freed people and their descendants became known as freedmen. On paper, this was progress. In reality, it created a bureaucratic category that would later be weaponized to strip people of their Native identity. Because here's what they don't teach you. Many of these freedmen weren't just former slaves. They were people with Native ancestry, people who spoke tribal languages, people who had lived as part of these nations for generations. The label freedmen would eventually be used to separate them from their heritage. Now let's talk about the Five Civilized Tribes. That label itself, civilized, was a colonial invention bestowed upon nations that adopted European-style agriculture, written languages, and yes, the institution of slavery. By the early 1800s, slavery was deeply embedded in Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole societies. But this wasn't the chattel slavery of the cotton plantations. The dynamics were more complex, more intimate. Enslaved Africans often lived in close proximity to Native families, working alongside them, sometimes marrying into them. The lines between slave and family member could blur in ways that would have been unthinkable on a Mississippi plantation. The Cherokee Nation, for example, held nearly 4,000 Black people in bondage by 1861. But many enslaved individuals spoke Cherokee, practiced Native traditions, and formed bonds that transcended their legal status. When the Trail of Tears forced the Cherokee westward, Black people walked that brutal journey too. Some as property, some as family, all as part of the nation's fabric. The Seminoles presented a different picture altogether. Their relationship with African descendants was more often one of alliance than ownership. Black Seminoles lived in separate but allied villages, paid tribute in crops rather than labor, and fought alongside their Native counterparts in the Seminole Wars. They became so integral to Seminole resistance that a U.S. general famously complained, "This, you may be assured, is a Negro, not an Indian war." What's crucial to understand is that by the time of the Civil War, the Five Tribes weren't just Native nations with Black slaves. They were societies where African and Native bloodlines, cultures, and futures had become deeply entangled. The legal categories of slave and free, Black and Indian, were already collapsing under the weight of lived reality. Did you know Black and Native histories were this connected? Comment below. The Civil War ended slavery, but for Black members of the Five Tribes, freedom came with a catch, a legal battle that would last for generations. The 1866 treaties between the United States and the Five Nations contained a revolutionary promise. All freedmen would be adopted as full citizens of the tribal nations. On paper, this was a monumental victory. The treaties stated clearly that freedmen would have all the rights of native citizens. They were entitled to land allotments, voting rights, and the full protection of tribal law. For people who had been property just years earlier, this was supposed to be their pathway to belonging. But here's where the betrayal begins. The U.S. government, having forced this inclusion, almost immediately began creating the mechanisms to undermine it. When the Dawes Commission arrived in Indian Territory in the 1890s to create the official rolls of tribal citizens, they didn't just record names. They created two separate categories: Indians by blood and freedmen. This distinction was everything. If you were listed as by blood, you were considered a real Indian. If you were listed as a freedman, you were something else. A legal citizen, perhaps, but not truly part of the tribe. Never mind that many freedmen had native ancestry. Never mind that they spoke the language, practiced the culture, and had native relatives. The commission officials, most of them white men with no understanding of tribal kinship systems, made snap judgments based on skin color and physical features. The consequences were immediate and devastating. When tribal lands were divided into individual allotments, freedmen often received the least desirable parcels. When oil was discovered on tribal lands, freedmen were frequently cheated out of their shares. And most importantly, when tribes began reorganizing their governments in the early 20th century, many used the Dawes Rolls as the basis for citizenship, and freedmen found themselves excluded. The Cherokee Nation provides the clearest example of this betrayal. Despite the 1866 treaty guarantee, the Cherokee Nation stripped freedmen of citizenship rights in the early 1900s. For nearly a century, Cherokee freedmen and their descendants were legal outsiders in the nation their ancestors helped build. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't access tribal services. They were ghosts in their own homeland. But the fight never stopped. People like Marilyn Vann, a Cherokee Freedmen descendant and engineer, spent decades challenging this exclusion in court. The battle wasn't just about benefits or casino money, as opponents often claimed. It was about identity, about the right to claim the heritage that was systematically stolen through bureaucratic sleight of hand. In 2017, after more than a century of legal battles, a federal court finally ruled that the 1866 treaty still stood. Cherokee freedmen must be recognized as citizens. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. Why did it take 150 years to enforce a treaty the U.S. government itself had orchestrated? Because the erasure wasn't an accident. It was policy. The same government that forced inclusion then stood by while tribes excluded, creating a legal limbo that persists to this day for many freedmen descendants. If the legal erasure was brutal, the historical erasure was even more complete. Because while courts could eventually reverse bad decisions, textbooks have the power to shape what entire generations believe about their own history. Open any standard American history textbook, and you'll find the same pattern. Native American history ends with the Trail of Tears, or Wounded Knee. African American history begins with slavery. The two narratives never intersect, never overlap, never acknowledge the people who existed in both worlds. This isn't an oversight. It's a deliberate construction that serves a specific purpose. Think about what happens when you separate these stories. You create the myth of racial purity. You reinforce the idea that America's racial groups have always been distinct, always separate. You make it seem natural that Black people and Native people should have different histories, different struggles, different futures. But reality was always messier, always more interconnected. The textbook omission starts with the earliest contacts. You learn about pilgrims and Powhatans, but not about the African sailors who arrived on Spanish ships decades before the Mayflower. You learn about the Underground Railroad, but not about the Seminole Maroons who created their own free republic in Florida. You learn about Indian removal, but not about the Black Cherokee families who walked the Trail of Tears alongside their Native relatives. When Black Native figures do appear, they're placed in one category or the other. Crispus Attucks, often called the first martyr of the American Revolution, is remembered as a Black man, but his likely Native ancestry is rarely mentioned. Third, there's the language of blood quantum, a colonial concept that reduces identity to mathematical fractions, something never part of traditional Native understandings of kinship. But perhaps the most insidious form of erasure is what happens in the classroom itself. Teachers, working with standardized curricula and limited time, often reproduce these silences without even realizing it. They teach the stories they were taught, using the categories they inherited. The result is that generations of Americans, including Black and Native Americans themselves, grow up unaware of this shared history. The impact of this educational erasure is profound. For freedmen descendants today, the fight for recognition isn't just legal, it's psychological. How do you claim an identity that your education told you doesn't exist? How do you prove belonging when history books decided you don't belong? If you're liking this content and you want to help us continue to put out videos like this, please leave a subscribe. These are the stories they don't teach in schools, and your support helps us keep digging them up. The fight for recognition didn't end in the 19th century. It moved from treaty negotiations to courtrooms, from bureaucratic offices to tribal council chambers. And nowhere has this modern struggle been more visible than in the Cherokee Nation. For over a century, Cherokee freedmen and their descendants lived in a legal limbo. They were citizens on paper according to the 1866 treaty, but in practice, they were excluded. They couldn't vote in tribal elections, couldn't run for office, couldn't access healthcare or education benefits. They were ghosts in the nation their ancestors helped build. The turning point came in 2007. The Cherokee Nation held a special election and voted to remove freedmen descendants from tribal citizenship. The justification? That the Dawes Rolls had created a permanent distinction between Indians by blood and freedmen. It was the ultimate bureaucratic erasure, using the very documents created to divide people as proof that the division was natural. But the freedmen fought back. Led by people like Marilyn Vann, they took their case to federal court. They argued a simple, powerful point. A treaty is a treaty. The 1866 agreement guaranteed citizenship forever. Forever doesn't have an expiration date. The legal battle dragged on for a decade. Opponents claimed the freedmen were only interested in tribal benefits, ignoring the deeper issue of identity and belonging. But the freedmen persisted, gathering genealogical records, historical documents, and personal stories that proved their connection to the Cherokee Nation wasn't about money. It was about blood, history, and right. In 2017, justice finally arrived. A federal district court ruled that the 1866 treaty was still binding. The Cherokee Nation must recognize freedmen as citizens. The decision was historic, but the victory was bittersweet. Why did it take 150 years to enforce a promise the U.S. government itself had brokered? The answer lies in the uncomfortable truth about America's racial politics. The same government that forced inclusion through treaties then stood by while tribes excluded. It was divide and conquer, perfected. Make native nations police their own racial boundaries, and you never have to get your hands dirty. The Cherokee case set a precedent, but the struggle continues elsewhere. Seminole freedmen still fight for full recognition. Creek freedmen face similar barriers. What's revealing is who opposes recognition. Often, it's not outside forces, but internal tribal politics. Some Native leaders genuinely believe that blood quantum should determine belonging. Others fear that recognizing freedmen will dilute tribal resources or sovereignty. But underlying these arguments is often the same racial thinking that created the Dawes Rolls in the first place. Should blood quantum determine identity, or should culture and history? Drop your thoughts. So where does this leave us? With a simple but radical truth. History isn't just about what happened. It's about who gets to tell the story. For generations, the story of Black Native Americans was told by people who had an interest in keeping Black and Native histories separate. The textbooks, the treaties, the legal categories. They were all designed to maintain a fiction of racial purity that never existed. But the evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. It's in the family stories whispered at kitchen tables. It's in the facial features that carry both continents. It's in the court rulings that slowly, painfully, correct the historical record. The erasure was systematic, but it was never complete. Reclaiming this narrative isn't just about adding a chapter to a textbook. It's about decolonizing how we think about identity itself. It means rejecting the colonial categories of blood quantum and racial purity that were invented to divide people who had always lived together. It means recognizing that being both Black and Native isn't an exception. It's a fundamental part of the American story. The fight continues in courtrooms and tribal councils, but the most important battle is in our own understanding. When we learn this history, we're not just uncovering the past. We're creating the possibility of a more honest future. A future where people don't have to choose between parts of themselves, where identity isn't a box to check, but a story to tell. If this history was hidden from you, share it. Question what you were taught. The story of Black Native Americans proves that when we reclaim erased histories, we're not just rewriting books. We're rewriting what's possible. Do you have Black Indigenous heritage? Share your family's story in the comments. Subscribe for more stories they tried to bury.